approach the end. And as Lord would have it, in his providential timing, in slight twisting the schedule by myself, we are going to finish the Gospel of Mark on Resurrection Sunday. After about a year and a half. And I've titled the sermon this morning, Confessions of a Centurion. Truly, this man was the Son of God. And so follow along with me as I read. We're going to be looking at the second portion, as we already looked at the first half of the cross. But I'm just going to read from verse 21 so we get the broader context once again, since it's been a few weeks. And they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. And they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him and divided his garments among them, casting lots for them to decide what each should take. And it was the third hour when they crucified him. And the inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified two robbers, one on his right and one on his left. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, "Aha, you who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." So also the chief priests with the scribes mocked him to one another, saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from that cross, that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him also reviled him. And when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And some of the bystanders hearing it said, "Behold, he is calling Elijah." And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down." And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." There was a lot of different notions of divine sonship or Son of God in ancient times. In the Greco-Roman Hellenistic world, their idea of a Son of God was a kingly royal figure or a military conqueror, a powerful person who, by accomplishing certain amazing feats of military victory or conquest, would be considered a kind of quasi-divine, godlike figure, a Son of God, they would call it. The Judeo-Christian idea of Son of God was different. You see, the Judeo-Christian idea or concept of Son of God traces itself all the way back to the Bible, and it doesn't have to do with someone achieving or earning that title, but it has to do with God bestowing that title upon them, having nothing to do with what they did or didn't do, by grace. And we first encounter that title in redemptive history all the way back in Exodus 4:22 and 23, when God calls Israel for himself, and he calls them Israel, my son. He refers to them with that title of sonship. And throughout redemptive history, we see the title start to take on nuanced meaning, different meanings, because Israel as a whole begins to fail in their calling to be God's children, God's son, as it were, collectively as a whole, who represent God and his perfect law and are a light to the nations and to the Gentiles. And so we see the development of this title as God begins to narrow it down to one person as representative of the nation of Israel in the monarchy, right? The king, and specifically King David, whom he makes a covenant with in 2 Samuel 7:13-14, where he promises to give David an everlasting kingdom and one of his descendants, a son of David, to rule on his throne forever. But the monarchy fails also to fully take up this mantle of Son of God. They fail. Solomon fails after him. The kingdom splits into two and divides afterwards. And the idea of this Son of God begins to take on a new meaning as God sends prophets to Israel. Prophets who predict that this Son of God will be a suffering servant of God, like Isaiah's suffering servant, who will be a righteous one, who will deliver God's people from their iniquities, who will carry them on his shoulders, who will be vindicated by God and raised on the third day. And this is what we start to see in the New Testament, and specifically in the Gospel of Mark. We see that at the beginning, it's Jesus who's announced by Mark in the very first verse of his Gospel as the Son of God. But it remained to be seen just what kind of Son of God he'll be. And then you continue reading through the Gospel, and you see exactly what kind of a Son of God he is. The Old Testament idea of a kingship, and a suffering servant who will atone for many is exactly who Jesus ends up being and fulfills in his person and in his ministry. And it's this title of Son of God, which is the supreme category in which we must understand Jesus, because it points to his intimate and personal and unique relationship that he alone has with the Father as the Son and as his only begotten Son. So at the beginning of his gospel, Jesus is acknowledged by God the Father as his Son at his baptism, at his transfiguration. He's acknowledged by demons. Both the light and dark sides of the spiritual world acknowledge Jesus' sonship as the Son of God. And now at the end of Mark's gospel, we reach a climax in a confession by the least likely person imaginable, a Roman soldier, a centurion, who after witnessing the manner in which Jesus dies, has no other conclusion other than truly this man was the Son of God. And the first confession from a human being in the Gospel of Mark comes not from a disciple of Jesus, not from a relative, not from even a Jew, but a Gentile outsider, a pagan, a battle-hardened military soldier. Son of God surpasses all other titles of Jesus. Every other title, whether it's Messiah, whether it's Son of Man, whether it's prophet, whether it's teacher, even Lord, because Son of God alone is bestowed on him by God the Father at his baptism and at his transfiguration. There is no loftier category by which we must understand Jesus' relationship to God and his person. And in no other place is Jesus revealed as the Son of God more clearly and more supremely than at the cross, where God meets humanity, so that a battle-hardened, pagan, enemy of God, after witnessing the manner in which Jesus dies, can't help but confess him as the Son of God. The question is, do you know him as the Son of God? Do you confess him as the Son of God? Do you know him as God incarnate, God made flesh? And it's the question we're going to be asking ourselves as we finish up our look at the cross. And so by way of review, since it's been a few weeks, allow me to catalog for a second all of the sufferings that our Lord Jesus has just experienced leading up to this point on the cross. On Thursday evening, at the Last Supper, during his final meal and his final night on earth, He predicts that one of his disciples, one of the 12, one of his closest friends is going to betray him. And then afterwards, on the way to the Garden of Gethsemane, he tells the rest of them, not only that, all of them are going to abandon him. They're going to desert him in the moment of his greatest need. And not only that, Peter, the chief of them, is going to deny him 3 times this very night, he says. That's what's going to happen. They get to the garden. Jesus throws himself on the ground in deep groaning and prayers to the Lord, God the Father, because he knows the agonies that await him on the cross. And anticipating the agonies and the horrors of the abandonment and the separation from God as he bears the world's sin on his shoulders, he begins to tremble, to quake, and even to recoil for a moment and contemplate whether or not this cup would be taken from him. Sweat great drops of blood, Luke says. And then Judas comes with a band of temple guards and soldiers. And he leans in by the sign that he determined ahead of time to give them so they knew who it was to arrest. He leans in and kisses Jesus on the cheek and sticks a knife in his back, as it were, by betraying him, his friend. The guard sees him, arrests him, and the other 11 run, terrified for their lives. But Peter follows at a distance. He follows the guards, and they take him to the high priest's house now to have a hearing, a kangaroo court type of a hearing by night, to try to drum up some phony charges against Jesus to use to pass the sentence of the verdict they'd already convicted him of, death. Nothing sticks. False testimony after false testimony. Finally, the high priest stands up, and he asks Jesus point blank, "Are you the Son of God?" Jesus says, "I am. And you'll see me seated at the right hand of God and coming on the clouds of heaven." This is blasphemous. This is outrageous. They all begin to chant for his death. They condemn him, and they begin to punch him and kick him and beat him and spit in his face. And they put a blindfold on him. And they say, "Prophesy, which one of us slapped you? Which one of us punched you?" The next morning, they bring him to Pilate, the governor of Judea, because he alone had the authority to execute capital punishment. The Jews didn't have that. He was the governor of Judea. Pilate knows he's innocent. He doesn't want to convict him, certainly doesn't want to condemn him to death. But for the sake of appeasing the crowds who are now chanting under the influence of the religious leaders for Jesus' crucifixion and to release Barabbas, he gives into the crowd. He wants to keep the peace, and he wants to keep his position, and he hands Jesus over to be crucified. And as part of this crucifixion process that the Romans had perfected as a method of maximum torture, degradation, and humiliation, he hands him over to the soldiers first to be scourged. And 2 Roman soldiers take their place on either side of Jesus. And they take a long, heavy leather whip that at the ends of it is fashioned with sharp metal, bones, and glass to act as a serrated edge for the strict purpose of tearing apart human flesh. And they begin to strike him, blow after blow after blow, on his back, on his chest, on his legs, across his shoulders, wherever they could connect, with all their strength, until his body is ripped apart, and his back is nothing more than a mangled mess of blood and tissue and bone, until he's half dead, can barely stand on his own 2 feet. And then they try to force him to take up his cross. And actually, before that, they begin to mock him. The scourging's not enough. Now they place one of their scarlet-colored military cloaks on him to kind of mimic the purple royal robe of a king. They fashion a crown of thorns to mimic a laurel wreath that they would crown conquering heroes and Caesars with, emperors, and press it deep into his scalp. And then they begin to mock him. They put a phony scepter in his hand. It's a stick. Hail, King of the Jews. It's a parody. And then they take the stick out of his hand and begin to beat him in the face with his own scepter, as it were, and punch him in the face. Until his face is so disfigured and his body so ripped apart that he no longer even looks human anymore. And now they strap that crossbeam portion across his back for the walk of shame all the way to the crucifixion site. But he's so badly injured, he can't continue carrying his cross. And so they grab a random guy, Simon of Cyrene, who's walking the other direction. They grab him and force him to carry his cross for him. And they get all the way to Golgotha, Calvary. And they take that crossbeam portion off of Simon's back, and they slap it on Jesus' back. And they lay him down so it nestles in neatly into the upright portion, the stake that then will be lifted into the ground. And one soldier holds his arm perfectly so he doesn't move it, while the other takes a 7-inch spike and places it at the desired location, the wrist. And he cocks the hammer back, and he begins to drive it all the way through the tissue, the tendons, and the bone, nailing his arm to the cross. And then they do the same thing to the other side. And then they take both his feet and put one ankle above another and take an even bigger spike that's long enough to fashion through both of his legs. And they nail him into the cross. And he's hanging there. Verse 25 says, at the 9th hour, which was 9 in the morning, at the 3rd hour, hanging, bleeding out, suffocating, trying to push himself up by his nailed-in ankles just to get a few small gulps of air to breathe, to expand his diaphragm, which is excruciatingly painful to do when your ankles are nailed in. And his raw and opened up back brushing up against the raw timber of the cross with every push. At the 3rd hour, 9 a.m. And then Mark continues his description in verse 33. And when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. The 6th hour is noon, and the 9th hour is 3 p.m. It's noon. Midday. And the first supernatural event that takes place is that at midday, it becomes as midnight. And the sun stops emitting its light, and pitch black darkness covers all of the sky and the landscape over all the land of Jerusalem and Judea. Darkness in the Old Testament was always a sign of the judgment of God. Right? It was the 9th of 10 plagues that God sent upon Egypt because Pharaoh hardened his heart and he would not let his people go. And in Exodus 10, 21 to 23, it says the whole land of Egypt was covered in darkness. We see that motif time and time again in the Old Testament. Darkness is synonymous with the judgment of God, and we understand what's going on here. God sent darkness over Egypt when he was delivering them from slavery in Egypt. And now he sends darkness again over all Judea as he's about to deliver them from their sin. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? What's going on here? Has God abandoned Jesus, his son? Has he forsaken his only begotten son? Right? Because God is not associated with darkness. Is the darkness a sign of God's absence? Is he absent from the cross and at this scene? You know, say absolutely not. The darkness does not indicate the absence of God. In fact, it's quite the opposite. You see, in Scripture, it reveals a lot that God even works in the darkness. He tells Solomon that he chose to dwell in a thick cloud of darkness in 1 Kings 8-12. And then Solomon passes on those words to the people in 2 Chronicles 6:1. Exodus 20:21 says that God chose to give his law to Moses out of the thick cloud of darkness. In 2 Samuel 22:10, God is described as descending for battle in darkness. And listen to what Psalm 18:9-11 says. Psalm 18, 9-11. He bowed the heavens and came down. Thick darkness was under his feet. He rode on a cherub and flew. He came swiftly on the wings of the wind. He made darkness his covering, his canopy around him, thick clouds dark with water. No, God is not absent from this scene at the cross. So why is Jesus saying this? He's saying this because of the presence of God. God is present in his judgment in a cloud of darkness, and Jesus is on the receiving end of the full and fiery fury wrath of God that's directed towards sin and sinners as he now carries it on the cross. And he senses with every fiber of his eternal being that for the first time in his eternal, infinite existence with God, as the triune God, God the Father, Son, and Spirit in perfect harmony, perfect unity, perfect communion, he for the first time now experiences what it feels like for God to look at him as a sinner. He experiences for the first time the displeasure of God. And it breaks him to the very core of his being to feel that separation from God. That's what's happening. I don't know if you understand for a moment. None of us could fully fathom. This is the wrath of God towards sin and sinners. We know what happens to people who die in their sin, right? Eternity of hell and suffering. So we can imagine that Jesus is here experiencing eternities of hell and of furious wrath that God has reserved towards sin right there in that moment on the cross. And it's so deep and so anguishing that he cries out to God, my God, why have you forsaken me? He had to feel it with every fiber of his being. He had to receive it fully, the penalty, in his body, in his person. It couldn't have just been physical. John Calvin, the great reformer, put it this way: if Christ had died only a bodily death, it would have been ineffectual, meaning ineffective. Unless his soul shared in the punishment, he would have been the redeemer of bodies alone. He feels it all. God spared him none of his wrath and judgment. In our place. He does this willingly. Paul says it this way in 2 Corinthians 5:21. God, he made him who had no sin, Jesus, to be sin on our behalf so that we might become the righteousness of God. He's carrying all of it. And that's what he said he would do. In Mark 10:45, right? For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom, a payment to rescue and redeem many. This is what's happening here. He's paying the penalty and taking the punishment for sin. That's what breaks him. He didn't say, my God, why have you forsaken me?" when the soldiers scourged him half to death. He didn't say, my God, why have you forsaken me?" when they're pummeling him and beating him in senseless. He didn't even say, my God, why have you forsaken me?" when they nailed him to the cross. He said it only as he's sitting there suffering and sensing the displeasure of God, and he can't bear it. That's what caused him to sweat great droplets of blood in the garden. It wasn't the physical pain, it was the spiritual, eternal pain that he knew he'd have to endure. And some of the bystanders, hearing it, said, "Behold, he's calling Elijah." And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine and put it on a reed and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down." So you can see what's happening here. I don't think this is a genuine misunderstanding. I don't think it's because of the similarities in Aramaic, the language that Jesus spoke between God, my God, Eloi, and Elijah, Eliah. I think they're purposely mocking him here. I think the mockery is continuing. Sure, they had an expectation that the eschatological Elijah would come again. They believed he would. He would come before the Messiah would be revealed. But I don't think they really believed he'd come and rescue Jesus, because they didn't believe Jesus was the Messiah. There's no way they actually believe Elijah's coming back again. This is a mockery. And so they say, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come down." In other words, the guy's saying, let me give him some of this sour wine, which is wine mixed with vinegar, probably taken from the soldiers. That was their typical drink that they would drink, and they would kind of stimulate them and keep them alert and energetic for duty. He takes some of that, puts it on a sponge, puts the sponge on a stick because Jesus is higher up, and gives it to him to drink, saying, "Hey, wait, I got one, guys. I got another one. Let's see if Elijah will come and rescue him." It's a joke. And it's a fulfillment of another psalm, Psalm 69:21. "For my food they gave me gall, and for my thirst they gave me vinegar." That's what's happening here. And the irony is, they don't even realize that the promised Elijah did come. Exactly as Jesus said he did after he came down from the Mount of Transfiguration in chapter 9. Remember, he says he did come. It was John the Baptizer who came in the spirit and power of Elijah, and they did to him exactly as they wanted to, exactly as they did to the other prophets. They killed him, and they're going to kill me too. So much fulfillment of Scripture here. Even in that, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The only thing that comes to Jesus' mind as he's suffering the agonies of eternal judgment, again from Psalm 22, which we've been seeing fulfilled right before our eyes, this entire crucifixion scene. It's the first verse from Psalm 22. And we read the rest of them. Psalm 22:7. "All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads." Verse 16, "For dogs encompass me. A company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and feet." Verse 18, "They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." They're mocking him. Verse 37. "And after the mockery," Mark says, "Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last." His loud cry is exactly the same loud cry that he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And it's shocking. It's shocking for him to shout out now, when by all crucifixion accounts that we have in history, At this point, the victim is so weak, he's barely conscious, he's barely able to speak. But Jesus is not only able to speak, he's shouting. He's crying out. This is a loud cry. It's the same word that Mark uses in the beginning of his gospel in Mark chapter 1, verse 3, when he talks about John the Baptist, quoting Isaiah as he comes, he's a voice crying out in the wilderness, preparing the way of the Lord. He's shouting out as a prophet shouts out his message. Jesus is not going out with a whimper here. He's in full control of his faculties and of his destinies. He's crying out. He's choosing on the terms in which he's to lay down his life and he's to die. Right? John 10:18. No one takes my life from me. I lay it down willingly. I have the authority to lay it down, and I have the authority to take it up. He's not a victim of man. He's not a victim of the horrors of crucifixion. He uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. What was the contents of his last breath? Breathed his last. To exhale, to expire. It's a euphemism for death. Mark doesn't tell us. John says in 1930 that he said, "It is finished." And Luke 23:46 says, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." I yield it. He's surrendering his spirit to God. That's what's happening here in his last breath. And after he does that, all of the synoptic evangelists, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, make this very important point, that a second supernatural event occurs in verse 38. Ordained and orchestrated by God, symbolic, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The curtain of the temple is torn in two. The from top to bottom makes it clear that this is not accidental, this is not coincidental. It is split open in two from top to bottom, perfectly down the middle. There were two curtains in the temple sanctuary, temple courtyard. There was a curtain in the holy place, also called the court of Israel. That was the innermost courtyard before the temple proper. And it separated the temple proper from that innermost courtyard. That's as far as the people could go. It was a very tall curtain, 80 feet. And then as you go into the temple proper, there was another curtain that separated the place which they called the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies. That was supposed to be the presence and the dwelling place of God. And only one person was allowed to go in there on one day of the year, the Day of Atonement, right in Leviticus 16, Yom Kippur. He was allowed to go in once a year and sprinkle the spotless lamb's blood on the mercy seat and on the altar to make atonement for his sins and for the sins of the people. And so there's some debate between some commentators as to exactly which curtain was torn here. I think the writer of Hebrews makes it abundantly clear. Turn to Hebrews 9:3. He describes this most holy place, the Holy of Holies, verse 3. Behind the second curtain, see that's the inner one, was a second section called the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies. And he continues to describe the elements that are in there. And then you get to verse 24 through 26. And here's what he says. For Christ has entered not into the holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. Nor was it to offer himself repeatedly, as the high priest enters the holy places every year with blood not his own. For then he would have had to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world. But as it is, he has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And then chapter 10, verse 19. Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, that is, through his flesh. He's saying Jesus' body, his offering of his very being, is the curtain. And it's been split and offered and delivered for us, and now we have access to the presence of God. He's talking about the inner sanctuary. He's talking about the dwelling place of God. No longer can the priest now rope him off and keep people separate from accessing God. We have direct access to the presence of God through Christ, the once-for-all sacrifice, and the temple veil was split open. That's what he's saying here. And there's a striking parallel, actually, in that term that Mark uses here, schizo, for split open or torn apart. The only other time he uses it is at the beginning of his gospel at Jesus' baptism in Mark 1:11, where he says the heavens were split open and a voice of God came down from heaven and said, "This is my son." You are my son, actually. In you I am pleased. And now once again, at Jesus' death, at the end of his ministry, the temple veil is split open and another voice confesses Jesus as the Son of God. Not God this time, it's a man. Look at verse 39. And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly this man was the Son of God." A centurion, a pagan, a Roman soldier. He's the first person in the entire Gospel of Mark, beyond God and demons, to confess him as the Son of God. It's striking. It's striking. How did he know? Divine revelation, obviously, but how did he know? It was the manner in which he died, it says in verse 39. When he saw the way in which he breathed his last. In other words, this entire crucifixion scene, yes, the darkness, the supernatural darkness ordained by God covering the sky. Yes, it was Jesus' bold confidence as he yielded up his spirit and shouting out loud with superhuman, supernatural strength that only God could have. It was all of it. Notice, it was by witnessing the death of Jesus that this soldier confesses him as the Son of God. He's able to see what so many others in Jesus' lifetime were unable to see, even though they'd witnessed miraculous, spectacular things. They'd seen Jesus heal congenital diseases. They'd seen Jesus raise the dead. They'd seen Jesus calm the storm and exercise power over nature. They'd seen him walk on water. And yet they weren't able to see him as the Son of God. But this man was. He sees Jesus for who he is. And I'm not saying he had a full-orbed Christology in his understanding of this title, Son of God, which we would now have on this side of the cross because we have the New Testament and all of the letters about him and the Gospels expounding him, and we get all of the rich implications of what it means for Jesus to be the Son of God. But I don't agree with the view that he didn't at all, and he was just a Son of God, like the many that they would have considered in their day, right? Like the emperors, there was the emperor cult. They understood what it meant to deify a man because he had accomplished great military conquest or great feats or whatever the case was. No, it can't be that. Because they would never call a man condemned as an insurrectionist to die the death of a criminal, the most humiliating, degrading death imaginable. He would not refer to him as a son of God. He would refer to a king as a son of God or a prince, not a crucified criminal. So I think he's saying this because he means it. And he means it because God has divinely revealed that to him. You see, that's the key there. Only by the grace of God and the gift of faith from heaven above can anyone confess Jesus as the Son of God. He did it. The question is, have we? Do you know Jesus as the Son of God? Have you confessed him as the Son of God? Or is he just a Son of God to you? You know, like a leader, an influential figure. He accomplished much good, great morals, great teaching, did a lot of good for the world. Or is he not even that to you? Is he less than a Son of God? Is he even less impressive to you than that? Are you unfazed by him? Like the bystanders and the crowds of people throwing scorn and mocking him. Are we going to keep mocking him like that? No, he is the Son of God. And he's calling everyone here today through the lips of Mark and through me here this morning to believe in him. To believe in him because he suffered a substitutionary death in the place of sinners, taking the full fury and wrath of God directed towards sin that would have condemned all of us to eternity in hell. He did that for us. And all we have to do is believe. And I know we can't believe unless he grants it to us to believe, but he says, come to me and ask. All who ask will receive, and all who knock find. Come and knock on the door of Christ. And if you do it with sincerity, seeking the truth, he promises to reveal that to you. That's his promise. He did it all. Cling to that old rugged cross, as we sang this morning. And there's something else we see. That it wasn't miracles, and Jesus performed hundreds of them, if not thousands. John says at the end of his gospel in John 20 that if he was to try to record all of the miracles and signs and wonders that Jesus did, all the books of the world couldn't contain them. So it's not that. But Jesus' obedience unto death had the power to take someone out of the kingdom of darkness and into the kingdom of light, like it did with the centurion. And in the same way, on this side of the cross, our suffering is a powerful witness to the transforming power of the gospel. Imagine what God can do through our faithful witness when we stay obedient to Christ in the midst of suffering and trial, and for some even death. I don't know if you heard, about a month ago, it was February 16th, the RCMP, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, they arrested Pastor James Coates, who pastors a church called Grace Life in Edmonton, Alberta, for holding worship services indoors, violating their health orders. And of course he held worship services indoors in February in Alberta. If you'd been there, you know how cold it is. Of course. And they kept him in there for days on end, violating his constitutionally protected rights. He couldn't contact his wife, couldn't contact his church, couldn't contact the elders or anyone for days, until they finally brought him before the judge. They laid out the charges, and they said, we'll waive all these and let you go. But you have to stop preaching, and you have to stop having church. And he said, my conscience is bound to Christ. I can't stop preaching. And they kept him in there for a month. Only a few days ago they agreed to release him, and that'll happen shortly, probably. In isolation, without any human contact, shackled in chains like a criminal. And do you know what his church did the first Sunday? And the second Sunday? And the third Sunday after? They had church. And the attendance doubled. And the attendance tripled. as the media and news outlets picked up the story and it reverberated all across the news cycle in the country, and even here, south of the border then. So much so that his wife, Erin, was given a 5-minute interview on Tucker Carlson, who has an audience of millions of viewers every single night. And she boldly proclaimed the gospel of Jesus Christ to millions. Our faithfulness in suffering is the most powerful testimony to the transforming power of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And he set the tone for us by his first and final and ultimate suffering and sacrifice. Where God's absence was most loudly expressed, God's presence was most profoundly revealed at the cross. And boy, was God ever present. Only God could rescue a sinner so far and separated from God like a Roman soldier. We'd never heard about him until this past week and Jesus taking the scene and storming Jerusalem. And he did it as a picture and a preview of what he'd promised long ago in the Old Testament to the prophets. That his plan of redemption and of salvation was always meant to include the Gentiles. It was never about Israel. Israel was the first, and the Gentiles were to come after through them. That's what he accomplished on the cross. It's not just Israel, not just Jews, but Americans, Canadians, Mexicans, South Americans, Europeans, Asians, Australians. God has called to himself a people from all tribes and all tongues and all nations and all languages and united them to him inseparably for eternity. One body. But in order for him to do that, in order for him to raise them up on the last day, to live with him in his presence and to enjoy him and his glory forever in his kingdom and in heaven, he must raise his son first from the dead. And that's what we're going to look at over the final 2 Sundays. Jesus' burial and Jesus' resurrection. Would you bow your heads with me?